The stray dog yelped in pain as the cop sprayed it with pepper spray, its eyes burning, body trembling. But the officer's smug expression faded the moment he heard a voice behind him, a voice that changed everything. This is a story about judgment, regret, and the unexpected twists life throws at us. A cop thought he was just dealing with another stray dog, but he had no idea who that dog belonged to. And when he found out, he wished he could take back everything. Stay with me. This one's going to hit hard. Officer Brian had been with the force for over a decade. He was known for being strict, by the book, and, some would say, a little too quick to pull out his pepper spray. He wasn't cruel. At least, that's what he told himself. But he had little patience for strays wandering the streets. He saw them as a nuisance, a problem that needed to be dealt with swiftly. In his mind, if the city didn't take care of them, someone had to, and that someone more often than not was him. That evening was no different. The sun had just begun to set, casting an orange glow over the streets as Brian stepped out of a small convenience store. He had grabbed a quick snack and a bottle of water before heading back to his patrol car. The city was quiet, the air thick with the scent of summer pavement. It was supposed to be just another routine night on duty. But then, he saw it. A dog, thin, dirty, ribs barely hidden beneath matted fur, stood a few feet away, watching him. Its eyes, deep brown and glistening, locked onto his. There was no aggression in its gaze, no sign of hostility. If anything, it seemed hopeful. The dog took a tentative step forward, its tail wagging just slightly, as if it believed, somehow, that this stranger in uniform might offer it kindness. Brian exhaled sharply. He didn't have time for this. "Shoo!" he muttered, waving his hand dismissively. The dog hesitated, tilting its head to the side. It didn't move away. It simply stood there, ears perked up, tail still wagging, waiting. Something about the way it looked at him annoyed Brian. He had seen countless strays in his time, dogs that dug through garbage, that barked at passing cars, that caused trouble for shop owners. They weren't pets. They weren't anyone's responsibility. They were just pests. And this one was no different. His patience ran thin. Without thinking twice, he reached for his belt, fingers closing around the familiar shape of his pepper spray. With one swift motion, he pulled it out and aimed. A sharp hiss filled the air as he pressed down on the nozzle. The reaction was instant. The dog yelped, a sound so raw, so filled with pain, that it cut through the evening silence like a knife. It stumbled backward, its legs shaking, eyes squeezed shut as it pawed desperately at its burning face. Its body trembled, confusion and agony taking hold. The once wagging tail now tucked tightly between its legs. Brian watched, feeling a fleeting sense of satisfaction. "That'll teach you to stay away," he muttered under his breath, already turning to leave. It wasn't personal. It was just another stray, another problem dealt with. But then, a voice shattered the quiet, a voice thick with anger, disbelief, and something deeper, something raw. "What the hell are you doing to my dog?" Brian froze. His heart skipped a beat. He turned slowly, his grip on the pepper spray tightening out of instinct. His eyes landed on a man standing a few feet away, fists clenched at his sides. The man looked rough, his clothes worn, his boots scuffed, his face lined with exhaustion. His military-style jacket hung loosely around his frame, patches barely visible under layers of dust. He wasn't just angry, he looked broken, but his eyes burned with fury. Brian's first instinct was to go on the defensive. "Sir, this dog." The man cut him off. "That's not just a dog, that's my dog." Brian's stomach dropped. The man took a step forward, kneeling beside the trembling animal. "Jack," he murmured, his voice suddenly soft, filled with something Brian couldn't quite place. Love, desperation, relief. "It's okay, buddy. I'm here." The dog, Jack, whimpered, his body still shaking. But the moment the man's hands touched him, he melted. Despite the pain, despite the burning, he leaned into the man's touch. He knew him, trusted him. Brian swallowed hard. The man looked up, his eyes locking onto Brian's. "You sprayed him." Brian hesitated. "I didn't know he belonged to anyone." The man scoffed, shaking his head, and that made it okay. His voice cracked slightly, but he quickly masked it with anger. "You saw a dog, and you thought what? That he didn't matter?" Brian had no answer. Jack let out a low whimper, shifting closer to his owner. The man ran a hand down the dog's back, his fingers brushing over scars, old wounds, healed but still visible beneath the dirt and grime. "He's been through enough," the man murmured, almost to himself. "More than you could ever imagine." Brian furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" The man looked up, and for the first time, Brian saw something in his eyes beyond anger. Pain, a deep, unshakable pain. Jack isn't just any dog, he said, his voice quiet now, almost reverent. He's a retired canine. He served alongside me in the army. Brian's breath caught. He saved lives. The man continued, his fingers still running through Jack's fur, grounding himself in the moment. He saved mine. More times than I can count. Brian felt something shift inside him. He had always respected service dogs. They weren't just pets. They were soldiers, heroes. And he had just hurt one. His throat tightened. I didn't know. No, the man said. You didn't. But you didn't even stop to check. Jack whined again, curling up against the man's legs. The sight of it, of the trust, the bond, the history between them, hit Brian harder than he expected. He had spent years seeing the world in black and white. Strays were a problem. Strays needed to be dealt with. He never stopped to consider that maybe, just maybe, not everything was so simple. Brian took a step forward, guilt gnawing at his chest. Is he going to be okay? The man sighed, his fingers ghosting over Jack's ears. I don't know. The words carried weight. Brian hesitated, then did something he never thought he'd do. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his own water bottle, and crouched down, slowly pouring a bit into his hand. He held it out. Jack hesitated, but after a moment, the dog sniffed at the water, then lapped at it weakly. The man watched, his expression unreadable. Brian swallowed. I messed up. The man didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging the truth of it. Then, after a long pause, he said, Yeah, you did. Brian exhaled. Is there anything I can do? The man hesitated, looking down at Jack, then back at Brian. His expression softened, just slightly. Yeah, he said finally. You can help me get him to a vet. Brian nodded immediately. Get in the car. And for the first time in his career, he broke protocol. He let a civilian and a dog into his patrol car, turned on the sirens, and sped toward the nearest emergency vet. Because some things were more important than the rules. Brian spun around, his face losing color. Standing just a few feet away was a man in a worn-out military jacket, his eyes blazing with fury, his hands clenched into fists, but his entire body looked tired. Not just physically, there was something in his eyes, a kind of exhaustion that ran deeper. It was the kind of weariness that came from carrying too much, for too long. Brian's instincts kicked in. His hand went to his belt, fingers grazing the baton. A reflex, a habit, but before he could say a word, the man crouched down, gently pulling the trembling dog into his arms. Easy, buddy, I'm here, the man whispered, rubbing the dog's ears. The animal melted into his touch, whimpering softly. Despite the pain, despite the burning in its eyes, it knew this touch, this voice, this man. The stranger stood up, staring directly at Brian. His jaw tightened, and his breathing was controlled, but barely. That's my dog, he said again, voice rough with emotion. His name is Jack, and I've been looking for him for months. Brian's mouth went dry. Sir, you thought he was just another stray. The man cut him off. Like he didn't matter. Brian wanted to defend himself, to say he didn't know, that he was just trying to keep the streets safe. But as he looked at Jack, still shaking, still trying to blink through the pain, the words died in his throat. The man took a deep breath. Jack isn't just any dog. He's a retired canine. He served alongside me in the army. He saved lives. And when I got out, he was all I had left. The weight of the words hit Brian like a truck. A canine? Brian had always respected service dogs. They weren't just pets, they were soldiers. Heroes. And he had just hurt one. He swallowed hard. I didn't know. The man shook his head. No, you didn't. But you didn't even stop to check. You saw a stray, and you thought he was worthless. The words stung because they were true. Brian had spent years on the force. He dealt with aggressive dogs, malnourished dogs, abandoned dogs. He'd seen the worst of what could happen to animals that had no one. And yet, he never really stopped to think about the stories behind them. Each one had a past, a reason, a place they once called home. But he had always seen them as a problem to manage, an obstacle to remove. And now, standing before him, was proof of just how wrong he had been. Jack wasn't a stray. He wasn't worthless. He was a soldier, a survivor. And in a single careless moment, Brian had inflicted pain on him without a second thought. He looked at the man again, really looked at him this time. There were scars on his hands, peeking out from the frayed sleeves of his jacket. His boots were worn down, the kind that had walked through more than just city streets. His posture was straight, disciplined, but his shoulders sagged under an invisible weight. He wasn't just a dog owner. He was a veteran. Brian cleared his throat. How did he end up out here? The man exhaled slowly, still cradling Jack protectively. I lost everything after I got back. Couldn't hold a job. Couldn't keep up with rent. One night, Jack and I were sleeping in my truck. Someone broke in. He fought them off, but in the struggle, he got loose. I searched for him everywhere. Shelters, streets, but it's been months. He looked down at Jack, voice breaking. I thought he was gone. Brian felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent years seeing homeless people as just part of the city's landscape, a problem for social services to deal with. But standing here, looking at the raw emotion in this man's eyes, it felt different. This wasn't just about a lost dog. This was about everything Jack represented. Loyalty, love, a piece of the past that was still holding on, refusing to let go. Brian shifted on his feet, guilt gnawing at his gut. I messed up, he admitted. The man didn't respond right away. He just stroked Jack's fur, his touch gentle despite the anger still simmering beneath the surface. Yeah, he finally said. You did. A beat of silence passed between them. Brian reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against his wallet. Let me help, he said, pulling out some cash. For a vet, for whatever he needs. The man hesitated, then shook his head. It's not about money. Brian nodded slowly, slipping the cash back. He understood. This wasn't something he could fix with a few bills. This was bigger than that. His chest felt tight. The weight of what he had done, what he had almost overlooked, pressed down on him. I'll make sure he's okay, the man said, his voice softer now. But you need to think about what you do next time. Brian nodded. I will. And for the first time in a long time, he meant it. Jack slowly stood, still shaky, but his tail wagged ever so slightly as his owner wiped his eyes. The dog's whimpering softened, though his body remained tense, his breathing uneven. Brian, for the first time in years, felt shame. Real shame. It wasn't the kind that came from getting caught doing something wrong. It was deeper. It was the realization that he had inflicted unnecessary pain, that he had judged without understanding. And now, he had to make it right. He looked at Jack, then at the man. I messed up, he admitted, his voice raw. The man didn't say anything at first. He simply kept his hand on Jack's head, his fingers running gently through the dog's fur, a silent reassurance. His eyes, though filled with exhaustion, held an intensity that made Brian shift uncomfortably. Brian took a slow breath. Is there anything I can do? The man hesitated, scanning Brian's face as if trying to decide whether he was truly remorseful or just looking to ease his own conscience. He sighed heavily before speaking. Yeah, you can help me get him to a vet. Brian nodded immediately. Get in the car. For the first time in his career, he broke protocol. No paperwork, no radio call to dispatch for approval. Just instinct. He opened the back door of his patrol car, something he had only ever done for suspects, not injured heroes. The man gently lifted Jack into the seat, whispering soft reassurances as he did. The dog winced but didn't resist. His trust in his owner was absolute. Brian slid into the driver's seat and flipped the sirens on. The red and blue lights reflected off the storefronts as they sped through the city streets. Every second felt urgent, each turn sharper than the last. Brian's grip tightened around the wheel, his mind racing. He had spent years believing in law and order, in rules and procedures. But at this moment, none of it mattered more than getting Jack the help he needed. How long has he been missing? Brian asked, glancing at the man in the rearview mirror. The man exhaled slowly. 6 months. I thought he was gone for good. I looked everywhere. He let out a bitter chuckle. Turns out, he was right under my nose, struggling on the streets while I was searching all over town. Brian's grip tightened on the wheel. The weight of his actions settled heavier on his chest. He had assumed Jack was just another stray, another nuisance to deal with. But Jack was family to this man. More than family, he was a partner, a comrade who had saved lives. As they neared the emergency vet, Brian's heart pounded. He pulled up to the entrance and jumped out, helping the man carry Jack inside. The receptionist took one look at them and immediately called for assistance. A team rushed in with a stretcher, lifting Jack carefully. The man held onto Jack's paw until the very last second. He's strong, Brian found himself saying. The man nodded. Yeah, stronger than most of us. Brian watched as the door swung shut, leaving him standing in the waiting room. He had spent years enforcing rules, believing in justice as black and white. But tonight, justice wasn't about laws or citations. It was about making amends, about seeing the world beyond a badge. And for the first time in a long time, Brian felt like he was doing the right thing. Jack was treated for the pepper spray, and within hours, He was back to licking his owner's hand, his tail wagging a little stronger. The worst was over, but the image of him whimpering on the street still burned in Brian's mind. Brian didn't leave. He stayed. He paced the waiting room, running his hands over his face as the vet cleaned out Jack's eyes, gave him fluids, and reassured the man that his dog would recover. Every whimper from Jack felt like another punch to Brian's gut. The reality of what he had done, the unnecessary pain he had caused, settled in deeper with each passing minute. The man, who had introduced himself as Jake, sat silently beside Brian. He didn't speak much. He just kept glancing toward the examination room, his fingers anxiously tapping against his knee. But every now and then, he would steal a look at Brian, as if he were trying to make sense of the cop sitting next to him. The same man who had hurt his best friend just an hour ago. Brian had never felt so small. He was used to being in control, used to enforcing rules, used to seeing things in black and white. But now, all he saw was the gray, the complexity of a world where not everything was as it seemed. Jack wasn't just some stray. He was family. He was a hero. And Brian had treated him like he was nothing. The door finally opened, and the vet stepped out. "He'll be okay," she said, offering Jake a reassuring smile. His eyes are still irritated, and he's a little disoriented, but the effects of the pepper spray should wear off in a few hours. He's strong. Jake exhaled a breath he'd been holding for too long. "Can I see him?" "Of course." Jake and Brian followed her inside. Jack was lying on a soft blanket. His ears perked up slightly as he heard footsteps approaching. The second he saw Jake, his tail thumped against the floor. Weak but happy. "Hey, buddy," Jake murmured, kneeling beside him. He stroked Jack's head gently, his fingers running through the fur, as if he were reassuring himself that the dog was really there. "You scared me." Jack leaned into his touch, licking Jake's hand, his tail wagging a little stronger now. The bond between them was unbreakable, forged through years of trust and loyalty. Brian watched in silence, something tightening in his chest. He had never had a connection like that. Not with a dog, not with a person. He didn't know what it felt like to have someone depend on him that way, to love him unconditionally despite his flaws. Brian hesitated before stepping forward. He knelt down beside Jack, keeping a respectful distance. He wasn't sure if the dog would be afraid of him, if he would flinch away. But Jack just tilted his head. Brian swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, buddy." Jack stared at him for a moment then, to Brian's utter shock, licked his hand. A small, hesitant gesture, but one that hit Brian harder than he expected. He didn't deserve it. He didn't deserve forgiveness. But here it was, freely given, without hesitation. Jake sighed. "He forgives you." Brian looked up, meeting Jake's gaze. There was still anger there, but there was something else, too. A sliver of understanding. "I don't," Jake continued. "Not yet." Brian nodded. "I get it." He reached into his wallet and pulled out his credit card. "I want to cover the bill." Jake frowned. "You don't have to." "I do," Brian interrupted. "It's the least I can do." Jake studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right." The vet processed the payment, and as they stepped outside, the cold night air felt different, heavier, charged with something unspoken. Jake adjusted Jack's leash, keeping a gentle hand on his back as they stood on the sidewalk. Brian shifted awkwardly before clearing his throat. "Where are you headed?" Jake sighed, glancing down at Jack. "Home. Or what's left of it. I lost my house a few months ago. Been staying wherever I can. That's why Jack went missing. He slipped out one night, and I couldn't find him." Brian felt his stomach drop. "You're homeless." Jake smirked, but there was no humor in it. Not the first vet to be. Brian didn't know what to say. The man in front of him had served his country, had given years of his life to protect others. And yet here he was, struggling, forgotten. And Brian had made things worse. "I'll do better," Brian said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Yeah." Brian nodded. "Yeah." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small notepad and scribbling something down. He tore the paper and handed it to Jake. "That's my number. If you ever need anything, food, a place to stay, someone to check on Jack, call me." Jake hesitated before taking it. Why? Brian took a deep breath. Because I need to do better. And because you and Jack deserve better. For the first time that night, Jake's expression softened. He gave a small nod. All right, officer. Brian, he corrected. Just Brian. Jake smirked. All right, just Brian. Brian watched as Jake and Jack walked away, disappearing into the night. And for the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe he couldn't change the past. Maybe he couldn't undo the mistakes he had made, but he could do better. And for the first time, he actually meant it. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit subscribe for more powerful animal stories. See you in the next one.